So yes.
I don't know if that money gets proposed in the general fund that we use it back
In my
general
opinion,
fund.
yes. That's where that middle gets weird.
Good evening. I'd like to call to order the City of Albany Budget Committee meeting. May we have a roll call, please?
Chrisman?
Here.
Pearson?
Here.
Carr?
Here.
Canoga?
Here.
Holden?
Here.
Olson?
Here.
Summers? Kellum?
Here.
Connolly?
Here.
Kobzinski?
Here.
Coburn?
Here.
Johnson? Here. Thompson?
Here.
Thank you. Is there any public comment this evening? All right, then we'll continue with the review by department, starting with Human Resources.
Budget Committee. I'm David Shaw, the Human Resources Director. I know in the past my esteemed colleague from the library, Ed Gallagher, has done some literary readings regarding the budget. And unfortunately, there's not a lot out there about human resources. But I did find a poem about a segment of what we do in human resources. I would like to start with a poem. We wheedled and threatened and blustered. We ranted and wrangled and roared. We chided and fretted. We scuffed. We groveled and swore and demanded. We spurned and we fawned and we brayed. We drunked and we stamped and we begged. Oh, look at this line there. We trampled on data and tossed ultimatums. We whimpered, we shouted, defended and doubted. We smiled, we jested, debated, orated, and scouted. We cooed, we booed, we yelled, we rebelled, we mourned, we stormed, we yammered, we slurred, and clamored. Flattered, cajoled and maligned, consented,
That's about it, too. Can you check your microphone? Is there a on thing that you need to push?
Yes.
That's okay. Thanks.
Okay, so the Human Resources budget is on pages 319 to 321. And the Human Resources Department's mission, in part, is to provide expertise, consultation, and leadership in the management of the city's human resources, which are our employees. Personnel costs comprise generally 70 to 80% of most departments' budgets, and human resources is in the background helping departments manage that 70 to 80% of their budget. What human resources does. We assist departments with writing or modifying job descriptions. We determine FLSA status, which means we determine whether a position is eligible for overtime pay or not. We conduct salary surveys, post recruitments, respond to questions regarding medical leave. We respond to questions regarding health insurance and other benefits, review performance evaluations, counsel employees and supervisors through performance management issues, interpret policies and collective bargaining agreements. We negotiate with the city's 4 bargaining units, investigate complaints of harassment, present new employee orientation, conduct exit interviews, and we administer workers' compensation. So I don't think anyone in my department will say that they don't have enough to do. For fiscal year 2013, we coordinated 50 recruitments, which meant we screened 2,070 applications. We processed 388 personnel actions, and that was actually the lowest number over the last 5 years. So far in fiscal year 14, we've processed 671 personnel action forms. We've processed 86 applications for family medical leave, and we've coordinated 32 workers' compensation claims. Since 2010, we've reduced our budget by approximately 25%, and we've reduced staffing by one position, which was 20% since 2011. To be able to accomplish our work with reduced staffing and funding, we moved some functions to finance and some to the city manager's office, and we increasingly rely on administrative staff in the city manager's office to help us get our tasks done. Our proposed budget for 2014-15 will grow by 5.25%, and that is predominantly the result of increases in personnel costs. As you look at the line items in our budget, you'll see a lot of zeros for materials and supplies. Some issues we faced in putting together the budget was deciding whether we should ask to put back the position that we lost in 2011. Putting back the position would provide relief to employees in human resources, finance, and the city manager's office. After discussing it with the city manager, we decided to continue at least one more year with our current staffing and current organization, and next year we'll reassess that. So, as usual, I'm the shortest presentation, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Yeah, out of the 2,070 or however many people that you interviewed, how many of them were qualified for the position that they sought?
You know, I don't have that off the top of my head, but a significant number of applicants get rejected for not meeting the minimum qualifications. Significant numbers all the time. That's been consistent for years.
Yeah, so it appears that you had like 20 applicants on average for every opening. Does that sound about right?
Okay, 2,050, so that would be about 40. I think, if I did my math right.
Okay.
But, you know, some jobs like police officer, we have 300, and other jobs we have, you know, 8.
Well, I was just looking at from the standing back, being the individual on the wall looking, if you have a large number of people who are qualified, and you have a small number of people who get hired, it means that we're offering a very generous portion of money for what we're asking them to do. If you have, you know, if the number of people who apply is very close to the number of people who get hired, we're not either is a very tight labor market, or we're not providing enough money to get people to stand up and say, yeah, I want that.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd agree with that completely. When I speak to my colleagues in other cities or even private industry, a lot of it's the same. They get a tremendous number of applicants. It gets whittled down pretty quickly by eliminating those that don't come close to meeting the qualifications. It seems a lot of people just apply for anything. A lot of our applicants are for police and fire positions, and they have some very high standards. So we do eliminate significant number of people in police and fire. So to some extent, it's probably a reflection of our compensation package, but I think there are just a lot of people who apply for anything. We know we have some people who apply for a variety of jobs, from working the counter and utility billing to being a police officer. They just seem to throw the hat in the ring for every position that's open.
But especially if they're needing to do that to fill a requirement. Yeah.
Don't know the reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Bessie?
Yeah, David, What negotiations do you have going on right now or within this next fiscal year?
Yeah, we have police going on right now. We've met with police twice
Okay.
so far. Before the end of the next fiscal year, we will open with AFSCME, I believe.
Yeah, that's a 7:15.
7:15.
So that would be, I
And-
guess, the next fiscal year.
Fire doesn't open again until 17.
And the increases, I know some of the different unions took some, and then it's going to be like in January, that type of, like ramping up. How is that? Do you have that?
All groups except AFSCME will be getting 2% on July 1, and AFSCME will be getting 1.6%. And the difference is the AFSCME contract was tied to the CPI, and the other unions, we just agreed to flat 2%.
Bill?
You mentioned 32 workers' comp claims. How many total employees in the city?
I think we have about, including temporaries, I think we're about 500. That's not right.
And of those workers' comp claims, do you know what percent or how many might be in public safety, police, and fire?
I think the majority are, but I can't give you a specific
Yeah.
percentage.
Okay, that was my guess, but, okay, thank you.
So I had a question, but you just gave me another one. So on page 103 for the positions, that totals, well, around 390. So the number you just mentioned, 500, the difference is,
The 390 are permanent or regular status employees, and temporary employees, especially this time of year in Parks and Recreation, make up the difference.
so those aren't listed in this table, but their dollars are in the wage, in the budget. Okay. Okay, so you're counting contracted as well in that 500?
Right.
We wouldn't have workers' comp claims for them, though.
Those who are on the city payroll as a temporary employee would
You
have
would,
workers'
right.
comp claims against
Okay.
the city.
So my other question kind of fits into that. I haven't been able to easily do this calculation, but with the early retirement, that we went through that process, have you done any analysis to know just wage, not including benefits? Has the average wage per FTE declined since you've finished all those early retirements?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, over time, there's been some increases, obviously. but I
Right,
don't
that would be
know.
netted against it.
But I think, as you're suggesting, because we had before we started the voluntary separation incentive program, the number of full-time equivalent employees was about 422. And as you see in the current budget, it's right around 390. So just the difference in the number of employees times the wage would suggest that the average
Yeah, and
wage
I
by
think the
that
short
number.
answer to that, Sue, is yes, if you were to take FTE by total salary. that
Right,
you
that's
would
what I
s-
was asking.
Yeah, you would see, because it's either been flat or reduced over time, then yes. Now, it may have crept up again because you've got people moving up the wage, both in terms of getting step increases and in some cases COLAs and that sort of thing. But there was definitely a decline, and
So other than the change in wage, I've heard you guys speak positively about that program, but were there other significant changes? I mean, were there different PERS funding rates based on when someone was hired, or none of that changed?
not really, no.
Just except for if total FTEs are down, your wages are down, then you have less PERS. Okay. All right, thanks.
The recipients of that users of the program would have been an average employee across the scale, from the low end of the scale to the top end of the scale.
It's an offer to just anybody.
Probably not. I'd say the average of the, and again, I haven't done a recent analysis of it, but I believe they would have all been senior employees, almost, without exception. Most of them were choosing to retire sooner than they otherwise would have retired. So they would have been probably toward the top of the pay schedule, and oftentimes were probably more highly compensated than the average employee.
The first year, we did offer it to anyone with 5-year service, so most of the people that took it were retiring, but we might have had 3 or 4 who were younger in their career, but the next years, you had to be retirement eligible.
Okay. Any other questions?
Just one question. David, what is the turnover? Is it pretty, I know the county was, when people come to these jobs, they do, a lot of times, not for the money, it's for the benefits, but also because they care to serve the people. And so I just wondered, are we pretty good on that?
We are very good. For fiscal year 2013, our turnover rate was less than 3%. It was like 2.9, and that's significantly better than our comparators. And that is not looking at the people who took the voluntary separation.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
I would add that, well, David certainly knows the statistic, and it's true and correct, that we don't generally suffer from high turnover. We do periodically lose high-quality employees because they have options. We have an example of that tonight, where, pardon? Oh, okay, and that we will talk about later. And we also have, we've had some other examples, like last year, for example, our community development director, which is one of our higher paid employees, chose to move along and go to another, she wanted a lifestyle change and chose another position in another place, another state. So, there is a need to, if you're going to retain qualified people, you've got to pay them enough to at least, keep in the market, which is what we try and do. And our goal, I think David has said over the years, our goal is to try not to be, we're not trying to be at the top of comparable cities in terms of our compensation package, but we try and at least shoot for the middle.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for the poem, too. Bring another one in about an hour. We'll need some laughter. Oh, let's do it.
Finance poems.
Yeah, right.
Let me open my book.
There once was a man with a bank
Yeah.
who,
I came, I gave, I went.
So I am teaching in the morning class, and I've told my kids, I don't think I'm as fun as some of the other teachers in the early morning class. And they agreed. But then they said, but you have great stories, so I could maybe tell a story. Appreciate the opportunity to present finance, and the outline I'd like to follow this evening. I'd like to cover the operating portions of finance, so a couple budgets we'll talk about, or in general terms, and then there are about 3 issues I want to address that have come up in questions previously with the Budget Committee, and hopefully answer some of those questions, and then be open for questions. First of all, I'd like to recognize the staff behind me. Ann Baker, Senior Accountant, Mike Merzinski, Senior Accountant, Mary Dibble, City Clerk, who's not here this evening, and I'm going to address that in the presentation. And also Marilyn Monson, our payroll supervisor. And so they get the hard questions, save them for them. And I did want to announce Mike Merzinski has accepted a position to be the finance director in Newport. And so we're going to miss a very valued employee from the finance department, and someone who has just done a lot of very fantastic work for the city of Albany over the past 10 years, and will be missed. But it's a two-edged kind of thing, because also recognize the opportunity for Mike and his desire to have that experience. And so it was really hard to say I'll support you in your choice either way. But one of those excellent employees that has just done a super job. So I want to describe a little bit what finance does, and summarized it on the screen a little bit in very short terms, and that's pretty much what finance does. That's our role with the city. The functions in finance are actually 16 different discrete functions that are performed in finance, and they range from municipal court to preparing the budget, working with departments to prepare their individual budgets, and then the citywide budget and the budget document. The reporting, so our financial reporting each year, working with the auditors to conduct the annual audit. Payroll is in finance, as well as accounts receivable and accounts payable. Risk management is part of finance, as well as conducting an annual transient lodging tax audit. So there are a variety of services, and I mentioned very discrete services in finance that are provided that benefit the city. So following the format that the different directors have followed, how do we do it? Well, indications are that we do it pretty well. The way we do it is we have 14.375 full-time equivalent employees in finance to provide, as I mentioned, those 16 different types of functions that are provided in finance and in municipal court. And the efforts of those employees have been recognized by the Government Finance Officers Association for decades of quality work and establishing levels of competence in the reporting and the presentation of budget, and most recently initiating a popular annual financial report for the citizens of Albany. The awards that are identified on the screen are awards that are part of the strategic plan. So in completing or fulfilling the objective that's described on the bottom of the screen, in the strategic plan on page 18 of the strategic plan, there is an objective, and that establishes the standard that we try to achieve in finance of qualifying for those awards and maintaining the systems and controls that need to be in place in order to be able to meet those standards and be recipients of those awards. I'd also like to recognize again 10 of those awards are attributed to the work that Mike has done over the last years, and so his name could be next to those next to those plaques. If you've been in the finance office, there is a wall of fame with all the plaques for those different years. So why we do it? Finance services customers in the organization and outside of the organization. Publicly, finance services the citizens of Albany, of course, the budget committee, and the city council in providing financial information and providing opportunity for public input into the budget process and review of financial reports. We try to be very transparent in the way information is reported and presented to the community. Those are objectives. Within the organization, on a monthly basis and even on a draw basis, mid-month, every employee is recognizing the work of our payroll department. And I'd like to mention, Jorge often sets very high standards for the continuity of internet and computer access in the city, and it's like 99.99%. That's also the standard we have in payroll. We have a very complex payroll system, and our payroll supervisor just does an amazing job. The accuracy of our payroll, especially given the complexity with police and fire and differential pays and premium pays and shift changes, and just a tremendous variety in municipal payroll. It's much more complex than a lot of payrolls, and we do a fabulous job, and employees recognize that at least once a month in the work that's done. And so I appreciate the work that's done in payroll and with Marilyn and her group. There's a group that I want to mention that's one of the customers that finance services, and that's regulatory agencies. And regulatory agencies are often identified by alphabet soup, but let me refer to some of these. We work very closely in satisfying regulations from MSRB, GFOA, GASB, GAP, SAS, AICPA, IRS, BOLI, OSHA, Moody's, S&P, and State of Oregon. So a variety of regulatory agencies that we work very closely with to meet the standards that are required and to be able to further the work of the city. And then, as I mentioned again, the public participation in the process. So in previous reductions, and I've referred to this, the finance office has reduced positions by 2.25 FTEs over the past few years. And a technical finance term, the squirt factor, is how we've done that. And an example is taking our minutes tonight. So appreciate Diana being here tonight from the city manager's office. And you've noticed in minute taking over the past year and a half, probably, we've had shared minute taking from a variety of public meetings, city council meetings, budget committee meetings, work sessions, variety of meetings where we've had and drawn on additional support. Mary wanted me to mention she's only 4 sets of minutes behind right now, and so the added help is needed. And the squirt factor also goes different directions. As David Shaw mentioned, there are duties from human resources that came to finance. Fortunately, they came to Mike's desk, so now they'll probably come to my desk. But that's what happens when we've cut back. There have been shifting of duties within finance, and the bottom line is people are doing more than they were before, trying to make sure we maintain those levels and standards of performance that we've got. Also, we're contracting out, so some of the minute taking, mentioned that we see Teresa Nix a little more often, and that's also an example of where we've contracted out services in order to be able to provide the same level of service with the reduced number of staff. And in the proposed budget, there is a request in the proposed budget to add 0.25 FTE to an existing 0.75 FTE position. And the purpose of that is primarily succession planning. We have a supervisor position that's in a very technical and very specialized program within finance, and we have staffing adequate to do the job if everybody does the job. But then that means the supervisor isn't able to do some of the supervisor duties, and there's not adequate training being done. And we're going to be in a period of transitioning due to a retirement in the supervisor level position. And I would very much like to be able to add the 0.25 FTE in order to provide opportunity for training in anticipation of the transition that will happen in the next few years. And that would give opportunity for that training to happen. There are 3 questions, as I mentioned, that I want to address that have come up from the Budget Committee, and then we can look at, I think some of these will address some of the specific line item questions that you maybe have. First is in the program budget for the Pepsi settlement. That's page 332 in the budget. There was a question on the transfer from the Pepsi settlement proceeds and the purposes, and there are 2 transfers that have been described in previous presentations, and I think I referred to actually in my initial comments on the budget as well. As you can see, towards the bottom of the page under transfers out, I transferred out of $500,000, and that transfer is to the capital replacement fund, and $300,000 is to repay the loan that the general fund took from the equipment replacement fund 2 years ago in order to balance the operations in the general fund. The other $200,000, if you recall, Chief Bradner talked about that as replacing a chassis underneath an ambulance and getting more extended useful life out of the ambulance by changing out the chassis that has exceeded its useful life. That's what those 2 pieces are regarding. There's a tab, actually it's the next tab in the budget, capital project, or capital budget. If you turn to that tab at the very top of the page, that identifies where that ambulance is located, and it refers to the equipment replacement fund. 217 is the budget fund. That's also happens to be in the finance budget. But I wanted to address that. There's been question on what those 2, or how that transfer broke out, and those are the 2 items that are included in that transfer. And then the second item I wanted to address on page 326, and I think there was a page on the dais tonight, a replacement page for non-departmental, and this is to address Bessie's question about could we break out the costs or the items that are transferred to the Parks and Recreation Department for outside agencies, and for urban forestry. Those were the recipients of that transfer. And the existing, or the budget that was looked at previously just had those in a single line item to Parks and Recreation Fund. And so the page on your dais identifies what's going to urban forestry and then creates a new line item that's called Parks and Recreation Outside Agencies. That doesn't change the budget, it just hopefully adds clarity and makes a little more transparency on how those dollars are being allocated. And then the third one that I wanted to mention is also on the dais, and it mentions a change on the resolution. It's also a change that doesn't affect total dollars, but, and let me give you let's see, I think it's the third page. It's under the risk management program. And again, for transparency, it's important that we break out. So let's see. So it's on the page 2 of the resolution. Page 2 of the resolution, a third of the way down the page, risk management adds a line item for transfer out, and that's the same transfer out that I referred to previously. On the previous edition of the resolution, that line item wasn't broken out. It was included in the Pepsi settlement projects. In proper budget format, it's good to break out the transfers out, so that's the only change there. And like I say, it doesn't change the total number, doesn't change the appropriation authority that's described there. It's a technical correction in the resolution. So those are the things that I had picked up on that were questions. Be happy to address other questions that people have.
Okay, looks like we got a few questions. Go ahead. Ray.
Okay. I noticed on the revised sheet that you gave us for the page 326, there's also a new line item right at the top, 54005 unemployment claims. That was not on the previous one.
So really, the reason it shows on one and not the other is based on the timing of when it was printed. Yeah, so Mike does adjustments, and workers' comp claims are shown one way at one point in time, and then they're shifted to the operating departments where they belong when an adjustment is made by journal entry. So if it shows on one and not the other, that's very likely what has happened, is that it's showing at one point when it's been posted in that department, and as it'll actually be transferred out and won't show in the future. And that line item is not part of an appropriation authority in the budget resolution.
Thank you.
Since we've gotten the Pepsi funds, how many years have we used the Pepsi funds to either backfill or outright do something for the budget?
Well, there was a sheet that was handed out, included in the packet that went out. So I guess the most direct use of what you're describing, Rich, would have been the $300,000 transfer from the Pepsi settlement to the general fund. Prior to that, $840,000 of Pepsi settlement proceeds was used to offset a sewer rate increase in 1 year. And see, I could look on my list and see if there are other things that might fit your criteria as well.
The individual was not important, it's just we seem to be going back to it because it's available over and over and over. And we just wanted to know kind of how many times that happened, not how much the money was.
Oh, okay. And I think the answer is once, that $300,000, for if that's as cut and dried as you're asking.
And the 500,000,
That would be second time.
yeah, okay, thank you.
So on page 323, the 50,000 in this current year's budget for the water, from the water fund and the sewer fund, we're not doing that this year because of the 500,000, or was that a separate
It was
decision?
separate as Mark Shepard described
The
in his
restructuring.
presentation with restructuring in the Public Works Department and how the admin charges in Public Works
Right.
are being applied back to departments now, that it would be a little different.
Yeah, Stuart, on page 325, it's about the spay and neuter program that's redirected to Safe Haven. We get some sort of a report from Safe Haven showing that that's what it's used for, or what do we get to?
We do get a report, and Marilyn receives that report, and so let me defer to Marilyn if she has it.
Yeah, we just started contracting with Safe Haven this year. That's a new provider for us. They refer people to us for vouchers for spay and neuter if they need them. The cats are they're taken to a local vet, and then we get an invoice from Safe Haven when they have a batch of them. I think we've received one invoice so far. Diana processes those, so we have not had very many this year.
How much money do we, so now, is there money that
It's about $45 per animal, I think. I can't remember exactly. There have been so few.
Yeah, okay.
In the past, we used up every penny each year, but I don't know that that's going to happen this year. It just depends on how many vouchers they send our way.
Yes, I see here is 9,500 is proposed, so.
Right, and that's the number that's been in the budget for probably the last 5 years.
I would think so,
It
yeah.
started out at 10, and then it got a 5% or 20%, 5% reduction when everything else was cut 5% a few years ago.
And so we do get some, I mean, we get the vouchers, so there's no question.
There's no question.
Great. All right, thank you, Marilyn.
Just quickly on page 323, you've got a line item for ambulance service fees, 43032, 1.8 million. Nothing prior, refresh my memory as to where that's coming in from that hasn't been there before.
Yeah, and that's part of the consolidation of ambulance fund into the general fund. Chief Radner talked about there had been so many expenses and just had been a lot of difficulty in being able to identify or capture costs correctly within a particular program. And so in this budget, we're proposing a fire emergency fund that would include the ambulance fund and what was the
suppression fund.
The suppression, that's what I was thinking.
Jeff?
Stuart, back on page 326, and this is almost as much a statement as is a question, because I think I know the answer to this. That whole section where it says transfer out, all of those funds being transferred out to those other funds are just general fund dollars. They come in through property tax or whatever, being transferred to those budgets for a purpose. I realize it's for a purpose, but being transferred to those budgets as a way to balance that budget versus any kind of mandatory or regulatory transfer.
That's correct. They aren't a mandatory or regulatory transfer. I would suggest, though, that they're based on a policy decision at one point or a determination by the council of a specific purpose. So as is the case with the urban forestry and the outside agencies, those have so there are specific purposes, but you're right. Those are discretionary dollars. We could choose to allocate them differently.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have any other comments on any specific fund comments on the other pages?
No,
or-
unless there are questions on additional pages.
On page 331, we're talking about the third bullet, about $1,280,000 was loaned for the construction of Oak Street LID. Principal and interest assessment payments will be transferred from the LID capital projects program in repayment of the loan. So where are we on that? I mean, is it just sitting there, or?
Mark and I actually met today and talked a little bit about the preparation of the financial and engineering report for the Oak Street LID, which will come to the City Council in probably the second meeting in June for consideration of that report. That would outline the methodology for the assessments. And then in July, there would be scheduled a public hearing for public comment on that methodology and on those assessments. And following the public hearing, the City Council could establish the assessments. And at that point, the assessments would be made. The last understanding I had was that Lowe's intended to make a lump sum payment on its assessment. I don't know if that's changed. It's been quite a while since I had that understanding. The Parks and Recreation Department also has an assessment from the project, and we've already built into the budget their payment schedule over a 10-year period that would be paid back to the Pepsi settlement program. And all the proceeds of that LID come back to the Pepsi settlement.
I believe the council decided to not assess the neighbors, but the Parks and Lowe's. Is
Parks
that
and
correct?
Lowe's are the two properties that would be affected by the assessment.
And Lowe's had, yeah, that's right, because the apartments, Lowe's had bought that property too, so that's gone, so, okay. And so we're just kind of,
So next month, we'll get more
Oh,
information
yeah.
be brought to the City Council.
another LID problem, oh, yeah. All right.
So that was
thank you.
a prior council decision that Pangs in the existing houses wouldn't pay
Yep,
an assessment.
sure was.
And the difference between the receivable, so that on your sheet that you emailed out, that's $300,000 that someone's already paid?
Well, the Pepsi settlement proceeds have been used for the construction of the project.
Not going to be reimbursed.
Correct.
Okay.
So effectively, if you look at the bottom of the page, the difference between the general ledger balance of April 2014 could be attributed to interest earnings and projects that came in less than what was authorized by the City Council, and that equals, was it $276,000? So that almost covers that amount. But that's, effectively, it's coming out of the settlement proceeds unless we identify a different place for it to come.
So then it's not quite correct to say that 1.28 was loaned for construction.
That's what was authorized. And the actual construction cost will be part of the report that comes next month. So how that may differ, and then the difference would retain or remain in the settlement proceeds.
But the full 1.2, if the full 1.2 is used, it's not all coming back as a receivable,
Right.
right? So it's not
Yeah.
really loaned.
So, pardon me?
It's not really loaned then, the whole 1.2?
Well, a loan has a specific meaning in budget law,
Okay.
which means it has to be paid back within 10 years. So apart from that, yeah.
I'm just confused because
that
the receivable
$300,000
amount
would
is
be a
different
ground.
than the loaned amount.
Yeah, the assessments won't equal, which means the settlement proceeds contributed that amount to the project and doesn't anticipate it being paid back.
Yeah. What about the Timber Ridge LIDs?
In the past year, the City Council approved a transfer of property agreement, and the city now owns that property. We haven't, the property north of Knox Butte, I should describe, because the Timber Ridge property owners still own the portion south of Knox Butte. The city hasn't as yet established a marketing plan on the sale of that property, but until the time that, or at the time that it does sell, those proceeds would come back to the settlement proceeds, the Pepsi settlement proceeds fund.
For some reason, I thought that we had decided to get it going and get it sold, get it marketed as soon as possible. I mean, that happened a long time ago, it seems like. And so I'm wondering why the delay?
Well, we've had some, well, one, the market's improving, and so, and even in some preliminary discussions with the person that we'd probably talk with about helping to develop that marketing plan, we haven't been hurt by not being too aggressive. There has been, it's been a few months now, but I have gotten a call a few months ago with some interest in development similar to a proposal that came to the City Council about 2 years ago, but nothing developed from that.
So did I hear you say that the person that we're working with to market it hasn't been real aggressive? Is that what we're saying?
We haven't entered into a contract or an engagement at this point. So it was preliminary discussions on marketing of the property.
Okay, well, we may have to bring that up in the council. Yeah, okay. Lloyd?
Yeah, following up on that, I do know that there's individual developers out there that are amassing vacant properties now. I understand the issue of things may be getting better in the market. The question is, who's holding the property and who's taking the risk? And I really believe that the time the council made that authorization, we said we want staff to move aggressively to turn around that. The longer we're doing it, we're taking the risk. And I think by the use of the Pepsi property, Pepsi money, that was really something we ought not to be doing. If somebody wants to buy it, the private sector takes the risk and pays us a fee. I think our instructions were do a cost recovery at minimum, what else ever you could, but do it in a very timely manner.
Yeah, and let me sort of chime in on this. That is our goal, is exactly that, cost recovery. And we've seen the market increasing. We have had some conversations with interested buyers, but we kind of wanted to start seeing what we are now seeing, which is property owner developers starting to get property together and have a willingness to pay something closer to what the real what we think the real market value is. But we will certainly get on top of it and hear the instructions. So.
All right. Looks like that's it. Thank you, Stuart. So we have our resolution. It's our time for continued deliberation on the budget. I don't think as of yet we've made any changes or requested any changes to the resolution specifically. So at this time, we'll just open it up to committee deliberation. Bill?
So I want to continue some of this discussion on the 500 million transfer from the Pepsi.
500,000.
500,000, not 500. Wish it was 500 million.
500 million.
You were on the committee, you didn't negotiate.
Yeah.
You should go to the federal government this year.
Too many zeros. 500,000. Anyway, I'm not in favor of that, and for several reasons. I think as council, we decided that money was not to be used for items that are not sustainable. So I think that the city has to operate as if that money does not exist. And so from that standpoint, this transfer is just not acceptable. But the other thing is, as I understand it, and Stuart, I think you explained it very well, we all know that we have not been putting money into equipment replacement funds in different departments. And in essence, we've been using those revenues to balance the budget, if that's a fair statement. And obviously, that is not a sustainable practice, so that's where we find ourselves today. And I think we're just continuing down this slope. And while I don't like the terminology that came out in one of the first meetings about having a hit list, I think that the way to approach this is to balance the budget in other ways so that we place a higher importance on having money in equipment replacement. And I don't know how you do that, Wes, or, you know, for all the department heads as a group. The one thing that did catch my eye, going back on page 302, and this is in the IT equipment replacement, and this came up in last week's meeting. It just caught my eye of the beginning balance that was brought forward every year. And when you looked at total expenditures, you can see why, there's an excess of $1.5 million carried forward every year. And now, this year, it shows up as reserve replacement. I don't know if this $500,000 number that we're talking about can come out of that fund and go back into equipment replacement, what was borrowed to put in the general fund, and then the $200,000 for the chassis replacement.
If I could respond to that, the purpose of the IT Equipment Replacement Fund is replacement of IT equipment. That's the computers throughout the city. But you're right, that one has been better funded than the rolling stock equipment, if we can generally characterize the other equipment replacement that way.
Well, I guess the question is, for the last 3 budget years, it appears that money's been sitting there but has not been used and has been brought forward each year in the beginning balance. In other words, if you look at the beginning balance of $1.6 million in 2011-2012, that tells me that was left over from 2010-2011. And then a higher amount the next year, and then a little lower amount. And if you're looking on 302, that's the numbers I'm looking at. So
Yeah.
I guess I don't understand the history. If IT said, hey, we need that money for equipment replacement, it's been around for several budget years. Now, if there's some upcoming need, and this year we're going to spend, $1.8 million on equipment replacement, I understand. But if they don't need that, or if they can get by with $500,000 less, that's where I'm suggesting you fill these 2 needs. And they share the pain with the other departments.
Yeah, Bill, it's the same problem, that you have with with the other equipment replacement. If you were to look at the regular equipment replacement fund, in some years we were carrying forward big balances, but we're now getting down to, not having enough.
Right.
We've managed to keep the IT replacement fund, on schedule, basically, and there are some major costs that are going to be coming at us, replacement of software, that kind of thing, as well as some other hardware purchases. So, you might be able to take some money out of it and reprogram it to other equipment purchases, but you're just trading one problem for another in doing that, and you have to be careful that you're doing it proportionately, because IT equipment replacement receives money from, different funds. It's not all general fund money, so, you couldn't use it all for fire department, for example. So
Somebody must have sent Jorge a text, because he just walked in. You better get in here right away. Coburn's going to raid your fund.
He's got that I'm confused look on his face.
yeah. Well, we'll let him. Jorge can give you a more impassioned defense of his fund, but again, it's you probably could take money out of it and use it for other purposes, but it carries costs.
I guess.
Well, and that'd be great to hear from in just a second. But again, just to repeat my concern, I don't think that this practice of what we're doing is sustainable. It clearly wasn't sustainable to keep not funding equipment replacement, if that makes sense. And now it certainly is not sustainable to keep borrowing money from Pepsi to backfill the lack of funds in equipment replacement.
Well, and in fact, when we didn't we have, when we upgraded the, for building and system, we didn't use funds from this, right?
Not
We
from
use-
the, not
right.
from the IT equipment replacement. Yeah, the IT equipment replacement is, you see this number there, but it's from every department has their own systems that they have to make sure that they fund to be replaced. So these are monies they're putting in for the purpose of being able to replace their equipment, their hardware. That's all the departments in there.
Yeah, it functions in the same way that our equipment replacement fund. So
Exactly.
we could probably attribute a percentage of that money, to, for example, to the fire department, and see what their balance is in IT equipment replacement, and reprogram it. Pardon? And it's not much, according to Ann, because they've used a lot of theirs. Yeah, well, Stuart's reminding me we probably could do it across the board, but again, you'd probably want to keep track of that, because you're having to, you can't spend, for example, water and sewer fund money, or shouldn't be spending water and sewer fund money, or street fund money on fire department purposes.
Well, part of your explanation confused me, but one of the things Rich said is, $174,000 was borrowed from Pepsi for this E-Plan system, which is a loan, which you told us is going to be paid back over time, so.
And it's in the budget to be paid.
Sure. But your explanation confused me a little bit, because you've got 1.5 million, I guess it is, for the reserve replacement. But as we went through these budgets, each department had money in there for IT replacement. Now, Ann's correct, in some cases it wasn't very much money, but it looks like there's several buckets of money that each department has gotten money for IT replacement, but then the IT equipment replacement fund also has 1.5 million.
So all those monies that you see that they're putting in their line item for IT equipment replacement actually goes to this fund. This is their fund here. And we manage, each individual has, for example, any equipment, they have to determine the useful age of that, and then the cost, and that's how they fund it back. So some of this money has been put in place for years. There's some systems that are, like, I know Public Works, actually there's money here from Public Works, which is not directly from the general fund, that for replacing the utility billing systems. There is also money for all the systems, including the financial system. All the other systems are in here. So those line items are money they put in, and this is the program that holds all those monies for them.
Okay.
And Ann is going to, if folks are interested, she's retrieving the information about what the current balances are. So when we say there's whatever the number is, 1.8 million in there, she can break it down as to who's got what in that fund.
Correct, yeah.
So who did you want to know? I mean, if you're looking at municipal court has, and this is as of December of 13. I haven't had time to update this. We've got municipal court has 68,000. Fire has got, let's see here,
Well, I don't know.
6,000.
But Ann, what you're saying is if you were to go through and add those all up, it would come to the 1.5 million?
Right.
Okay. You don't need to go through
I mean,
individual.
but
I appreciate the
it's-
effort, and I understand it a little more of where that comes from, so.
But it's, each department replaces their equipment at different rates. And if you're looking directly at fire, their replacement budget, even in this, is 0. So they haven't been, and if you take a look, I believe you'd see that I think Public Works has got the most currently funded as far as their IT equipment.
So would it be fair to say then that really the IT department doesn't own very much equipment, that mostly each department owns it, if you want to look at it in that?
Yeah, each department owns their own equipment, and they fund their own equipment and software. We own very little, probably in that list. The IT department, even though they manage, we manage a lot of the equipment, we have about 200,000 in our IT equipment replacement because we have more expensive equipment.
Sure.
So we're actually underfunded for what we need to replace, but other departments have much more money in this pool. but they've been saving it for a long time because they have expensive equipment and systems they have to replace.
Well, and I can appreciate what you're saying about the equipment in your department, because during your presentation, you mentioned all the viruses and spam and all the other things that you've stopped from getting in. So, yeah, I understand and appreciate what you're saying there. Thank you.
And it's not a question for you.
No,
so,
okay,
yeah,
so I'm not-
so, yeah. As far as I'm concerned, you are.
Okay.
This is just kind of follow up on Bill's thought process. You know, one of the things going through, and I think we've said it several times, Stuart even said it this evening, there's a lot of things in here that are policy choices that are being made by the council, or even actually by this committee when we approve the budget and pass it on to the council for approval. There's lots of policy choices being made, and you know, whatever you want to call it, those choices are how we're prioritizing this budget. It's how we are prioritizing what is going to be spent here in the city. And I think the prime example goes back to the question I asked Stuart, and on page 326, there's $701,000 being transferred out of the general fund, and I totally realize that there's purposes behind that, and there's decisions behind that, but it's $700,000 coming out of the general fund, going to areas that are not required, not regulatory, not anything other than a choice being made by the decision-making bodies, whether it be this or the council. Again, that's $700,000 that can go to a police department. Okay, that's $700,000 that can go to the fire department. So we're making a priority choice. We're setting priorities by taking that $700,000, and you know the biggest part of it, $568,000 of it, which is 81% of that, goes to 3 items. It goes to public transportation and it goes to the outside agencies. So we're making a priority choice to fund those items versus funding the police department. Now, if that's the choice that this body wants to make, and if that's the choice the council wants to make, then that's the choice that's made. But that's what I mean by taking a real hard look at some of the items in the budget and prioritizing those items and making some what would probably be really hard, tough decisions. You know, you want, instead of 500 coming out of the Pepsi fund, there's 500,000 here. What would have to happen is that basically the outside agencies would not be funded, and you would reduce the amount that you're sending, you'd reduce it by all, pretty much, the amount that you're putting into public transportation. Public transportation would then have to find a different way to fill their budget. Do it through, you know, getting more money from some of the partners, Lynn Benton, OSU, get it from raising fares. You get it from a lot of different sources, but that would be the effect of making that decision, is that public transportation would need to find some other way to fund their budget or fund a portion of their budget. And that's what I meant the first evening when I talked about trying to set priorities and work through and make some hard choices, because you know, taking 500 from the Pepsi settlement to do equipment replacement, I realize that someday that money may come back, but it's really not the sustainable way to keep the budget going, or to actually create the budget to go off into the future.
Yeah, if I could say one thing about some of the transfers, particularly relative to public transit, there are issues there that would be pretty complicated. It would take time to sort of unravel, because we have made commitments through with the federal government in regard to receipt of monies for buses and things of that nature. So it's not I mean, your point is well taken, Jeff, but there's probably more to that particular issue than simply saying we could reprogram that money this year, because I really don't think we could reprogram all of it. We'd probably be in violation of some contracts if we did.
So do those contracts, those commitments, do they center around buses we've bought? Do they center around number of rides we give, number of routes we take? I mean,
Yeah, we'd have to, is Chris here? Okay. Mark, it looks like he's volunteering to come up and wade into this, which I suspect is dangerous territory. It's been a while since I've looked at this issue, but we do have, all I'm trying to say is that we do have some obligations, and it would take time to disentangle.
Before Mark jumps in here, give him some time to think some more. I just want to be clear that the $500,000 from the Pepsi settlement isn't showing up in the general fund, but there is $500,000 from the street fund that comes in that in part makes it possible to transfer out the 701. So we have these two $500,000 amounts that we've talked about at different meetings.
Yep.
Okay.
So I think Wes generally covered about what I know as far as the details on untangling it. It would be difficult. You have commitments not only to but bus purchases, some grants that we've accepted, but you do have commitments to our partners, OSU, Lynn County. We're part of an MPO, the Corvallis MPO. Funds a significant portion of the loop. The other thing to understand is that if you want to stop funding the transit system, you are then, unless you can find replacement funds, which are not easy to come by, and I can guarantee you will not find those funds in fares by raising fares. Then you're going to have to forego federal funding, that subsidy you get from the federal government. And so, we leverage those dollars fairly well between the general fund and what we do get from our partners for a significant number of federal funds. And if you want to get into some of those details, I have those numbers back, I believe, back at the table there, if not up at my desk. But if that's something you want to do, it would be something that would take months to go through, talking with the Federal Transit Authority, talking with our partners to work through. But if that's the direction we're given, then we would undertake that.
Floyd?
Looking at page 323 and the revenues for the general fund, I'm wondering what the percentage of privilege tax or franchise fees are that we're charging the other utilities, and whether there is a cap on those, and how do they compare with other communities. And as an example, I think our electric franchise fees, 3.5%. I think Corvallis charges 5%, and I'm not sure if there's a statutory limitation. So while we look at the expense side, I think we need to be asking ourselves some equity questions on the revenue side also. There's almost $4 million sitting there in franchise fees and privilege fees, other than our own utilities.
Our electric utility, which is one of our bigger franchise fees, it's set at 5% currently by agreement, so I don't know where
It's 5? Well,
Yeah.
the number came from
But-
PP&L's rep.
No, that's not accurate, I don't think. Mike is our franchise administrator, and it's 5, and it has been ever since I've been here now. I was approached a couple of years ago, and I think I've said this on a number of occasions, by PP&L representatives saying they'd be willing to increase it to 7% if we wanted to go down that route. And that was at a time when, we were right in the middle of the recession, everybody was looking for money, and my sense is that the council didn't want to impose yet another burden on ratepayers at a time when they were having a tough go, houses were being foreclosed and that sort of thing. But it is, in the future, I mean, that certainly could be, a a relatively small but not insignificant revenue source.
Well, the 2% shift would be over $800,000.
Potentially.
So I think we need to think about those things, take a look and see what they are, rather than just let them float through the budget, assuming they're constant.
No.
Floyd, did you indicate that that might be the case with other utilities as well?
I don't know the answer, Bill. That's a question I would have, is what are the existing, are there any statutory limitations, and what do other communities do?
Yeah, good point. Good point.
1% would be 100,000.
Scott?
Trouble with that approach is it's kind of regressive. For instance, I have relatively good income, and I don't use hardly any utilities. So it'll be a great thing for me, but the guy with a big family, it's hard on him.
I think the analysis of the impact of any potential decision is a separate question than what the facts are.
Very true. Got a question?
Scott had something first.
So I hear some really good comments here. There's a lot of things that are questions. I guess my biggest concern is the structure of this committee and the format that we work in. That are we trying to, I mean, we can make small, subtle changes, but are we trying to do too little, too late? I understand the process that we have a strategic plan, that we go to projections of what the year would look like, and then the finance department, city manager, and all the departments do their best to be able to allocate expenses. I really believe by the time we get to the community is looking for us to be able to say, did we dot the i's, did we cross the t's, did we give it our best effort? And review the numbers and say, you know what, there's just nothing significantly out of place. And I think that they're looking at us to be able to say, are you robbing fees like Pepsi? Are you robbing from street maintenance and things like that? Make sure that you don't do some things that are unsustainable that we've all talked about. I personally believe, I'm not sure how much we can do to be able to go back to everybody and say, make some changes. I think we would all agree that we have some serious problems in our community, and this might be the tip of the iceberg that has to be addressed. I personally feel that we're underfunded in police, but I don't know if we're underfunded. I think we're underfunded in fire. I don't know how many positions, but I think we're underfunded. So those things are negotiable as to what we think an acceptable rate should be. I think that we would all agree that we're underfunded in our capital, and we're off. And so the way I look at this is, by the time we've made it to tonight and a proposal to approve a budget, I don't know how much we actually have the ability to do. But we can all make a recommendation that the path we're going down right now is unacceptable and unsustainable. And what I would recommend is that this body either continue or form a new group that explores every one of these options over the next 6 months before we get to January, before we do an income projection. And we assist by going through the strategic plan. We go through each of the different departmental FTEs that they have allocated, and we take a look at alternative revenue sources, because we've got to find out how to get more money into our budget. And it's not going to come through appreciation of our property and the taxes that come in from that. So we have to look at other alternative revenue sources, as Floyd is recommending, or saying, let's take a look at. We've got to take a look, as Jeff is saying, what are the consequences of being able to remove some of the transfers that we have going out? And I don't know if we can all sit behind a dais like this and work those problems out. I think we need to sit down and say, what is the consequence, what is the effect, what is the benefit? And we need to be able to come up with a whole list of recommendations that we would make to the council to say, these are the things that we need to do in preparation for next year's budget before it ever gets to the departments, before it ever gets to a presentation and a format that we have before us. And I think that we've got to somehow be able to figure out how to have more revenue and spend less on things that aren't as important. But as Jeff is saying, at some point in time, we've got to set priorities. Is it more important to have a police officer on the street, or is it more important to have a librarian or a bus driver or a city employee that works in finance or whatever that they're coming from. We have to help set those priorities. And I don't know if we can look at things and say that right now. I know that Wes has alluded to, in the departments, we always talk about the strategic plan. I think that group would first take a look at the strategic plan and the metrics that we have for measurement of our service delivery and see if the strategic plan truly aligns with our priorities and our budget allocation. And from there, we take a look at it, we say, here are the proposals, here are the alternatives. This committee wouldn't make those decisions, they would make those recommendations to the council, at which the council would say, this is what we're going to do. And I think we talk about a lot of different funds that we don't want to run. And I look at my personal budget at home and say, wow, you know, I put a lot of money every single month towards a 401k and a retirement plan. Those are great things. I call that the PepsiCo fund. Okay, PepsiCo fund is going to help with police and fire buildings. It's going to help with economic development and everything. But if I'm taking a significant portion of my budget every single month and putting it towards my retirement, but I can't feed my family and I can't pay my house payment, then what good is retirement going to be if I never make it there? And I think at some point in time, we've got to take a look at, as horrible as this sounds, we've got to take a look at PepsiCo funds or something and say, at some point in time, we have to look at reality and do a reset. And it's really nice to be able to say, we're going to go and do all these things, but if we can't buy a fire truck, and if we can't buy a police car, and we can't put people in the streets to protect us, what good is economic development going to do for us? That's right. Who's going to come to our community if our crime rate is high and we don't have a good response time for our fire department? Who's going to come to us maybe if we don't have bus service for transit? There are decisions that this all goes into, but I don't think that this meeting and the approval of this budget is the appropriate time to explore those. And what I would recommend, I think there's some really good things that have come out of the discussions over the last couple of days, and I personally really thank the department heads for the incredible work, because I think we live in an awesome city, but I think we all fall short of where we want to be, and we're just putting off today's problems till tomorrow, and we're hoping that our computers don't fail, and we're hoping that we don't have rising crime because we don't have enough officers, and we're hoping that our fire department truck doesn't fail and such, and we're just putting things off like some people do with their home budgets. And so I guess what I'm saying is, I think we need to come up with what we have the ability to prove tonight or for this budget cycle, and we need to come up with a process to be able to fix those problems before it comes to us next year.
Dick?
Yeah, I'm looking at this performance series for our children's performance, the Mondays at Monteith's, Northwest Art and Air, and it looks like they come pretty close to balancing. But the question I have is there's various income sources here, and how do we keep track of these? Do they go into the general fund under some entry? Do they just go to the Parks Department, or what? Okay.
They do go into the Parks and Recreation Fund. We have individual categories for each one. So, for example, when you look at Northwest Art and Air Festival, there might be 5 or 6 different line items: hot air balloon fees, food vendor fees, donation fees, parking fees, and we track each one of those, and they do go into the fund that actually pays the expenses for those, which is the Parks and Recreation Fund, Dick.
Thank you.
And Scott, you're talking about taking things down and whatever, and I'm going to throw this out to the committee. As I brought it up earlier, it's about council and mayor pay. And I've been doing some figuring, and nobody knows when the last time there was any type of increase for the council. I mean, we don't do it for the money, but also none of us put in for reimbursements. I mean, I never have, other than going to the LOC meetings, you know. But I'm suggesting, well, actually, a few years ago, there was a young woman who actually filed to run for council. And she found out how much time it was going to take, and with her young family, it was just too much. And sometimes, you know, it's not a lot of money, but sometimes it may offset a little bit of maybe helping with daycare, you know, night care or whatever, that type of a thing. That's the only reason that I would be bringing this up. And I bring it up now because I'm having experience with that, and I can see where it could be, you know, why not get some younger people on the council? I mean, not that I want to replace anybody, but still, it's not meant for just mature people. I don't want to say old, but mature. And so what I'm suggesting is it's a very small amount, is that right now, for the public, counselors get $110 a month, and Mayor, do you get $200?
Counting the internet, so it'd be 160.
Oh, you get 160, okay.
50, so counselors are 110 plus the 50.
Okay, so I got that wrong, I thought it was 200, because I get 100 and...
Wes says...
Yeah, just for the record.
Okay.
May 24th, 1989, the council approved an increase for council members from $100 to $110. And the mayor went from 50 to 160. Effective date July 1st, 1989.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow.
June 14th,
1906.
2007, the city council approved a $50
Yeah.
a month increase for internet service with an effective date of June 1st,
2007. So. And so the stipend is actually, the stipend for the internet service, and in fact, all city council compensation is regarded as a salary.
Yeah, and so, okay, so then I may have to change the mayors and stuff. What I was suggesting is that the council goes up to $200, and that the mayor goes up like the same amount, so it'd be, how much is it, 160, so you would go to 250. And so I figured that out, and actually, it's going to be only around $8,000 a year. And I was going to ask Stuart, what is the general fund, what is the carryover or the contingency?
1.2 million.
Because I'm proposing that it just comes out of the general fund.
That's the,
Didn't I?
yeah, the,
Department pays into our salary.
yeah, the city council budget is in Fund 701, not the general fund.
Oh,
But-
okay.
But the same principle would apply.
All right, so.
And that amount is within the estimate for beginning balance or contingency. So,
So do you know how much it is?
how much the beginning balance is?
Mm-hmm.
It would be,
You can probably find it faster than I can.
I mean, the amount of the increase would not require a new revenue source. I mean, there's
Right.
Flexibility.
And that's what I was.
right.
So, anyway, so I am proposing that because it's been a long time, and I know some cities don't pay their city councilors anything, but maybe it would help some younger people if they decide to run, so that we can get a little bit more of a variety of people. And so that's the only reason that I'm...
Would you like to make a motion and see if you get a second? and then we
Sure,
can
I would
discuss?
move, okay, I would move that we change the council salary from 110 to 200, and the mayor from 160 to 250. That's both $90, right? Okay. So that's what I was suggesting.
Not including the internet.
No, that would
That's
be,
on top of it.
that's
Okay.
on top of it, yes.
Is there a second?
But we have a dais of cowards. I'll second it just for the heck of it.
Thank you.
I
Further
do have something to
discussion,
say
Dick.
to it.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I'm satisfied with the pay that I get. I guess you can call it pay.
So am I.
One thing I do miss, though, from the good old days, was that back then, we got an actual check. You didn't just transfer it to my bank account. And back in the good old days, we had a local Safeway store. And I really enjoyed going down to the Safeway store and getting a case of beer and cashing my council check. And there'd usually be neighbors there, and they'd get a kick out of it, too. So, I'd enjoy that. Now I realize checks, cost about $25 a piece to process or something like that. And you could deduct that if you wanted, just, if you could give me a paycheck, that would be more than enough satisfaction for me.
Rich?
For lack of anything, I guess this gives me heartburn for a number of reasons. And it gives me heartburn not because I don't think that people earn the money, but that you think we are worth so little. Well, realistically, there are people on the dais who make $150,000 a year, and we're spending probably half of our work week, some weeks, working on council business. Now, realistically, is $200 a month I would be happy if what happened was I didn't have to write down what it was that I got paid, all my expenses, and I just got a couple of $100 a month just for the heck of it. You could pay me in beer. I mean, we could probably make a deal with Calapooya or, and wine, yeah. And I say that in jest, but realistically, $110 in 1989 is what, about $250 or $300 now? I mean, it's, if you you go back to 2006, gold went for $600 and some dollars now it's 12 from 2006 to now. That's what the dollar is worth less.
Here's some bitcoins.
I was getting $30 in 1972.
Well, that's paid more then than now.
I think so.
Yeah. Gasoline costs 30 cents a gallon.
35.
Yeah. Anyway.
But like I say, I'm satisfied. Being on the council is a good insurance policy. It's well worth
it. Sharon?
As far as keeping my neighborhood from being intruded upon.
Sharon has the floor.
It doesn't make any difference on me. I mean, I guess, I'm fortunate that I can be able to subsidize my expenses, but I've just never felt it to be right to be able to turn in expenses, and I do incur a lot of expenses, so, and a lot of traveling and going to out-of-town meetings, but I just have looked at over the years, I have just volunteered for many years. I figured it's part of my volunteer service, and I have very fortunate to have a wonderful husband that subsidizes my volunteerism. So, but in other words, if it was not that, our household could afford it, it does make it hard, I think, for somebody to want to be able to run, because you are not going to be able to be compensated for your expenses. And that part, I mean, many people are very shocked when they find out, I'm $200 a month, they're just floored. And the one difficult thing I think it does mostly with the mayor's position, is I am invited to every single nonprofit, and I know a lot of the council is too, many events and many dinners and fundraisers, and a lot of them are $50 or to $100 a plate. And that's one thing that, I just have to opt out on a lot of them, but many I attend, and that's out of my pocket. But so I write off a lot of donations during my tax forms. So it really doesn't, I feel I'm fortunate for being able to, give my service to the community and subsidize it, but it would be hard for most people.
Would you hazard a guess at if you really were trying to encourage not just a young person, but a person of any age who didn't have the means to subsidize those direct expenses, not necessarily to pay them per hour for their time, but just for the expenses incurred related to it? What what is that number monthly? Just a ballpark.
Oh, well, from counselor to mayor would be different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say, I don't know, I've never counted it up because I really don't how much I go in the hole.
Any council person want to hazard a guess here?
And I don't know if I want to say publicly, I don't tell my husband how much it adds up to.
Wes?
Yeah, and if I could, I mean, Mayor Knope is pretty modest about it, but I would say she spends more time and attends more function as mayor than anyone I've ever worked for, and it's not a criticism of anybody else. It's just a recognition of the many, many hours and events that she attends. There's a lot of discretion, I guess is the point, in these offices as to how much you want to do and are willing to do and are able to do. And I have some experience at that myself. I was a volunteer school board member for a number of years, and you know, different members of the board were able to contribute different amounts of time and resources to their position. So it's not a fixed thing that you can easily home in on and say, okay, it's that amount. We do cover, and that is another point, and what the mayor sort of said but didn't, is that you know, council members can submit for direct reimbursement for events. So, for example, if you go to a Chamber of Commerce dinner, we can cover the costs for a council member to go to that. We can't cover their spouses, which I think is ridiculous, but that's Oregon law. But any direct out-of-pocket expense that a city councilor has for fulfilling an official obligation, you know, we budget for that and we can reimburse for it. It's been the practice of the city council here in the time that I've been here that most people don't submit much in the way of reimbursement requests.
Okay. And just one more thing before we go to Jeff. That I just want to remind, there was some discussion that this motion does not include what somebody had suggested was to tie this stipend to something else, like the pay increase for unrepresented staff or something like that. So I just want to not forget that suggestion, which I thought was good.
And I just want to call for the question and get a vote taken.
There was one other hand. No? Done? Okay. All right. So do you want to read back the motion for us, please?
Johnson made a motion to change the council salary to $200 and the mayor's salary to $250 plus internet service of $50.
All right. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you for discussing it anyway.
I need a roll call.
You need a roll call? Okay.
It's a nice gesture of you, Betsy, yeah.
Collins,
No.
Kristen,
No.
Kristen,
No.
Keller,
Yes.
Canova,
No.
Holden,
Yes.
Olson,
No.
Summers, Kellum,
Yes.
Connolly. Yes. Krasinski,
No.
Coburn,
No.
Johnson. Yes. Thompson.
No.
Thank you.
I'd like to make my comment anyway. I was going to.
Oh, I'm
both.
I just want to go home.
I do believe that all of us are involved in volunteer organizations, and none of us are compensated for that. And there's something in our heart that has to draw us to wanting to do that. I do believe that the resolution, I do believe the proposal that you were, submitting about a pay increase is a valid one. The reason I voted no is because I would recommend that come afterward and that we flush that out with a whole bunch of other things. I think, for me, it would be inappropriate to say we're going to underfund organizations, and as insignificant as this amount is, and it truly is insignificant when you're talking millions of dollars that we're discussing today, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars that were funded. So to look at that's an insignificant amount, but I think, in my personal opinion, it might be inappropriate for us to discuss that amount today when we are trying to approve a budget, and quite possibly delay that and bring that up as a future discussion as a part of a subcommittee or some of the hard work that needs to be done in the next 6 months. I just would like to disconnect the two. I'm not saying I'm not in favor of it, I just would like to disconnect the two at this time.
Jeff?
And just following right up with that and your earlier comments, I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that this committee recommend to the city council that a budget subcommittee be put together and provide a report back to the council by, I mean, like, what kind of date would be effective? March 31st of 15? December
No.
31st of 14? And present a report back to the council by December 31st, 2015.
I'll second that.
14, I'm sorry, 14.
So there's a second.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, I can ask, what kind of a committee, how many, and what composition do you think?
You know, I think you would, you're going to, if you went down the line here, you're going to get, I don't know how many people are here, 12 or so? 13 are here? You're going to get about 18 different answers, okay? So my motion, the intent in my motion is to leave that up to the council.
Okay, sounds good.
Could Diana reread the motion?
This made a motion to form a budget subcommittee and to report back to the city council by December 31st.
I think the only change in there that I said would be to make a recommendation to the council to form a subcommittee. This group wouldn't actually be forming that subcommittee.
So what I'm not hearing is what specifically would this group do?
Everything he said about a half an hour ago. Just looking at the different ideas that were thrown out today, Scott is totally correct. By the time the budget gets here to us, there's not that much we can do. Or there probably is stuff we could do, which would put Wes Stewart and all those people back here for 24 hours a day for the next 2 or 3 weeks, because this has to be done within a certain time frame, and state law requires it to be someplace in a certain time frame. So, you know, by the time it gets here, some of the very significant items that we talked about this evening really can't be dealt with. I mean, you know, this committee could take a look at, Public Works could bring the report back to that committee and address some of the issues with public transportation as far as what commitments have been made and what can or cannot be done with some of the money that's going into there. So that's the intent of the motion. Now, I doubt very much if she wants to try and write all that in a motion.
Well, I'll tell you my approach to the budget. I think there's 2 ways to put together a budget. You can have a committee like this that has their ideas and suggestions and recommendation, and it goes to, basically to Wes. Or, the way I perceive it's being done now, and the way I prefer it's being done, is it's Wes's job. And he works with all of the department heads, and they put together a budget, and they present it to us. Now, you say there's not a whole bunch we can do. Assuming that we get to a resolution to adopt this budget tonight, I will be voting no. And it's because of this issue on the equipment replacement and borrowing some money. I've pretty well explained my position on that. So I guess the answer to your question, or to Scott's question, what can we do at this point, is we say no. And basically what I'm saying is, you got to go back to the drawing board, and what you've proposed to me is not acceptable. So if there are enough no votes tonight, and if everyone, if there are enough people that agree with my thoughts, then that's some direction for Wes, and he goes back to the drawing board with his department heads and come up with something that hopefully is acceptable. I understand there's a time crunch, but I personally don't want to try and tell Wes how to do his job, is the way I look at it. I might be able to tell him, I don't like the job you did, and that's a little different.
It's happened in the past.
Dick, and then we'll...
Yeah. You know, I don't like the idea of trying to reinvent the wheel. Volunteer people come in and try and reinvent how we're going to set up a budget, how we're going to set up a city organization. Here are people that I think are a really good city staff. I've worked with 5 different city managers, and West is right up there at the top with them. And a finance guy that he's got the answer to all the questions, and nobody argues with the answers. Now, you want to have a group of people who come in on a volunteer basis. Now, some of you may be money people and business organization people and that stuff, and have some ideas. But you're going to come up with an idea, and then you'll come back, I guess, are you going to then tell the city staff how to come up with the budget? Or are you going to come back to the full budget committee and have us talk about it and agree with it, disagree with it, argue about it? And then some kind of cobbled together thing, we tell the city staff, okay, here's how we're going to run the city now. I see it as a fool's errand, to tell you the truth. I really do. So I'm going to have to vote no.
Sharon?
So, I mean, I agree with Bill, and staff puts a lot of time into preparing this budget, and they know what is needed to be able to run their department and be as efficient as they can to provide quality services for us as citizens in the city of Albany. Not easy putting the budget together, so we have spent 4 nights now reviewing it, and we need to trust staff that they know what they're doing and what they need to be able to operate their departments. But we could form committee after committee, and what you're doing is putting more time on to staff to be able to meet with a subcommittee or more time at the budget committee. They need to do their job. And if we keep adding more time for them, for us to be able to want to maybe do some more basically micromanaging over the budget, it's going to take them more time. And also, our staff needs to know, when we adopt the budget, this is what they have to work on for the year. And I don't think it's very comforting for them if all of a sudden they knew that every several months our budget committee is going to meet, or a subcommittee, and maybe there could be subjected to some changes. They need to be able to operate within the budget that is, set forward to them. I mean, I think, Jeff, to kind of meet your goal, and I think we did this too when you were on the council, as the budget committee met more often for updates. And we could do that when we find out what property tax revenues come in, within the fall. The budget committee convene. Let's see where we're at. What does it look like for our revenues? We always get monthly updates, from the finance department on what our revenues are at. But I think that's something we could do as a whole, the whole body, is meet maybe a few more times. Instead of a subcommittee, it's difficult at that. The subcommittee might make changes, then all of a sudden you're having to go to the full body and be able to explain all those changes. That takes more staff time. So a subcommittee meets, you're going to have to be paying for, it's going to take time for administration to be able to handle the minutes for each one of those meetings. And I know our staff is really stretched thin when it comes to even trying to keep up with the minutes that each one of the city bodies, have incur on that. So I think just meet more if it's need be, but to form a subcommittee, I don't think is in our.
Yeah, there's some great comments, and Bill, gosh, I appreciate where you're coming from. I think there's two problems and there's 2 solutions. First problem is what to do about the current 500 and 500 and whether or not that's acceptable. I hear you saying that. And that might be appropriate to be able to send back and say, fix it. We don't like the solution that you've come up with for those two funds and where the revenue would come from. I also look that there's a long-term issue, and I don't know if it's currently within the scope of our finance and our different departments to come to council on a regular basis, either on a work session or a regular council meeting, and say, you know what, I have this idea that we raise our utility fees by such and such. Or I have this idea that we could not take money from the general fund and do this, and propose that. I think there's a group that needs to give them direction and to be able to help brainstorm some of those ideas. I do agree with Sharon that we have an incredible staff here, and they need to be able to do what they do best, and that is run our city, and we cannot overburden them with trying to figure out some of these things. So it's got to be a balance. At the same time, I remember when I took my first very, very high-level position where I was running a company, it was on my shoulders. And I was given some great counsel by other individuals who were in that similar role as the CEO, that the company would only be as good as my ability if I did not choose to look outward and get other people to counsel me and to continue to educate myself and to raise my ability level. So the company would only be as good as the individual leading it. I think our city staff looks to private industry to say, give us recommendations, help us, or else why have this committee right here? We know that the finance program does a phenomenal job of checks and balances, and I know this column adds up to this column. And so we're just here, listening and going, okay, great. But I think our responsibility is to help create solutions and to help guide them and to be a sounding board and a group of individuals who care about the city and say, I'm going to help you run your finance department better by asking some questions that they may not have thought of. So as long as we don't overburden staff, that they can't do their job, which I agree 100%, yet at the same time we come up with some solutions and we look outside of the box and we explore some things where they can spend a little bit of time to be able to say, how can we do this? I think it's appropriate, but we've got two problems to solve. One, what you're suggesting with the 500 and 500, is that an acceptable solution? But second of all, how do we look to the long term to come up with better positions for our city before it makes it to this committee? And I think it needs to be a small group of very focused, interested individuals, and I don't know what that group would look like, but I think the charter is review the strategic plan, look at alternative funding services, prioritize items, and how do we adequately protect and fund our general fund.
Rich, then Wes, then me.
Than me.
If what we're going to do is trust staff, we don't need to be here. Trust but verify. We have people here who are competent, who are honorable, who do their job. They screw up just like we do. That's what this is about, is, okay, what's it look like? Does it make sense? If we're not going to input, we don't need to bother doing this, because we're wasting everybody's time. Now, as I understand the committee would be appointed by the council, reporting back to the council. So you would be asking staff questions, not telling staff what to do, because you don't have a right to. It's the council that does that. If the council thought it was a good idea, once back, came back to the council, then it's a good idea. Okay. And you're going to have a number of different thought processes where that's concerned. I mean, there are a number of things that our staff can learn from people outside, and sometimes those things make good sense and sometimes they don't. But I don't want to get to the point where, oh, gee, we'll just meet a few times. That's not going to do us any good unless we get into the nuts and bolts of whatever it is and have some understanding I think the biggest single problem, when you're in a constricting economy, when you are looking at cuts, the hard thing is to know where to cut. Making that choice is a tough thing to do, because almost every time it stings somebody. Having some help doing that, I don't think is a bad thing. And if you want to just spend the money, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, that's what they did in Russia, and that's kind of where they ended up. I mean, we have a limited amount of money, and we have a whole lot of talent, and you put the two of those together, we ought to be able to come up with some decent solutions.
Yes.
Just some perspective, if I may.
You know, we often talk about the difference between policy and administration, and rather than try and get into that sort of technical and arcane subject, really what it boils down to, I think, is the division of labor typically between folks on the council and those of us on staff is we're kind of the how people, and the council's sort of the what people. And oftentimes the city council will enlist the assistance of citizens to help with the what questions. What should we be doing? Should we be doing public transit? Should we be putting more resources into police, fire, etc.? And then that what decision then gets communicated to us, and you say, all right, this is what we want you to do. You come back to us, and within the constraints of law and all the other things that we're hired to sort of know and monitor on a regular basis, we carry out. Now, you could argue that the question of what is essentially a city council responsibility. That's why you review the strategic plan. That's why you were elected, was to consider those what questions. But it is not uncommon for a city council to enlist help from the community to say, all right, we want greater advice on those big questions. And of course, the Budget Committee is a specific Oregon thing. Most states don't have budget committees. In fact, I think we may be the only one that has a statutorily required budget committee, and it is a little bit of a mix because it gets into both what and how. I mean, your specific task that the statute requires you to do is to review the budget prepared by the budget officer. So, and that clearly can get into what kind of questions, and that's, or how kinds of questions, and that's what Bill is saying is that my proposal, and I'll take credit for it, my proposal to take some money from our settlement reserves and put it into equipment replacement, that's a bad how. I don't like it, and I want you to come up with some different or better idea. And that's, to me, that's perfectly in keeping with the function of the Budget Committee if that's, what the majority of you feel. So, in response to the overall question that's before you right now, the motion from Jeff is, sure, it's totally appropriate for the council to say, all right, we want to enlist some help in trying to look at those big what questions for the next year. But it's also perfectly appropriate for the city council to say, no, we want to do that ourselves because that's our job. So that's a decision I think that you need to make. Do we want more of that, or do we want to just reserve that and take it on as a city council? I don't know if that helps any, but that's staff perspective.
Okay. Well, I would say along the lines of what Bill was talking about, I felt over the years that the things that the Budget Committee can do, and it's the present meeting schedule, that there, in some years, we have had maybe as many as 5 different changes that we've asked for. And most of the time, as I recall, those have been specific things like, don't take that $500,000 from this fund, take it here instead, or reduce these line items because we don't want that money to go there. And we've done that in the past, and I'm comfortable. And that's what I feel like the way it's set up now, the Budget Committee is able to do. We have done earlier meetings I thought we had one in November one year, but I know we've had January meetings that are just work sessions where we get a little bit of information, update on something that's changed. Maybe it's the impact of compression or something positive that's going on to help prepare us for where staff thinks the budget is headed, or they're looking for decisions or from us so that they can go ahead and prepare the detailed budget based on that. And meeting after the property tax information, is it all the way to mid-November before you know? October? Okay. We could meet in October, or you find out in October? Okay. So I think that's a good idea, having one earlier meeting. I feel totally comfortable as a lay member of the Budget Committee, knowing that any time throughout the year, if I have an idea, or I hear from someone else, or I read something else that another city is doing, I'm totally comfortable contacting staff or one of the council members about that, and that's what I've felt like is an appropriate way to function as a lay member of the Budget Committee, since we're really only active during, these official meetings, it seems. And I don't feel like having a separate committee get into so much of the how and the work that I would expect the city staff to do. So I'd be more along the lines of Sharon and having an earlier meeting, a few more meetings leading up to the detailed budget preparation, if that's what we feel like we need to resolve what we've been seeing for a long time. And as far as some of the funding issues, the narrowing of revenue and expenses, if we're not fortunate and revenues pick up in different ways, then we will have some really tough decisions to make in future years. Jeff?
Well, just a couple of comments. One, the intent of the motion is not to have this committee meet and then bring a bunch of piecemeal things back and present it to the council, and then the council go and make changes to the budget, that kind of thing. The idea is for this committee to meet, bring back some kind of recommendation of items that could be looked at for the 15-16 budget. I mean, whatever gets done for this budget, okay? So it's not so much trying to do things where staff's going to put a lot of work into trying to do something with the current budget, or the budget that we're getting ready to approve, or getting ready to vote on, I should say, this evening. The other comment, I just really, really want to make sure that my motion and my comments have nothing to do with not having trust with staff, or not thinking they're not doing their job. I think Wes put it great between the what and the how, okay? And it's probably the what that I have a problem with, okay? I have a problem with some of the policy choices that are made that then the staff has to go and put the how together. So that's what I'm questioning. I'm questioning the choices that are made, and those choices are made by the city council. Those choices aren't made by staff. Staff is just taking those choices, and within the constraints of what they have, both legally, staffing-wise, they are then doing the how part of it. And so, to me, this committee would be questioning the what part of it. What can be done to move more money to the police department, move more money to the fire department? You know, when you look at the strategic plan, the strategic plan is in any organization, whether it's this city or a private business, the strategic plan is an overall plan of where you want to go into the future. It's kind of at a high level. It's a little more vague, and the wording in it usually is so that you have some leeway to do different things. When you get down to the budget, that's the detail of that strategic plan. Well, in between is this great big hole of interpretation, okay? So my interpretation of the strategic plan when you go through there and you read all the stuff about safe cities, is that we should be spending a whole lot of money on the police department and the fire department. And I'm a huge supporter of the Boys and Girls Club and some of these other outside agencies, but we shouldn't be sending money to these outside agencies when we're underfunded in the police department. Those are the kinds of what decisions that I see that committee bringing back to the council and then allowing the council to make those decisions.
Scott. Or Michael.
Yeah, I think you've got focused. Why can't we have that during, and maybe not this time, but have those kind of debates with the larger budget group? You know, Wes mentioned the ORS, and the ORS talks about getting a budget is created, we get the budget message, and then it talks about this, we as a budget committee discuss and revise the budget. I think that's what we're debating right now, the idea of how much discussion and revision that goes on. The idea of revision is you've got to have something first. And I see you're trying to take some time to try to impact how it looks when we get it, but I, as a volunteer member, I don't want to spend too much more time in extra, because I would like to be part of any, if we did do, because some of those decisions that you're talking about as far as the outside agencies and the transit, I want to have some impact on. So we're kind of circling back around once again. But I think as Oregon law sets up this budget committee, I think just a matter of how much discussion revision we want to do, and I think we can do that, perhaps, if you want to vote no now, and that will create more discussion revision or not, but I'm not in favor of more meetings for the sake of meetings. We have more meetings of the budget committee, but I'm not really in favor of a subcommittee.
Ray?
Call for the question.
You had a hand up.
You know, we've been kind of having this discussion, and go back to at least 6 years ago when Councilor Reed was asking the very same question about when do we get to the element of prioritizing and how do we go about doing that. And I don't know what the right answer is, but you know, just in response to Jeff's question about using the example of the outside agency, I think the larger question is, what are the community needs and what should we provide and what should others provide, and what's the most effective way to do that? You know, it may be that if we have a need, in using the Boys and Girls Club as an example, and just for the record, I'm on the board, but I'm not arguing for a position, they can probably do something at a whole lot lesser cost than we can. If it's fulfilling a community need that we agree fits into the strategic plan, then we ought to be trying to find a way to make that happen. So I wouldn't limit it just to what do we as the city go about doing, but what do we as the city enable to happen to meet the overall community need. You know, several years ago, there was a proposal to have a library district. There were pros and cons to doing that. But it was certainly worth the discussion at the time, and I think those are the types of discussions to have again. There are different ways to do things.
Jeff's called for the question, so.
Kristen made a motion to have a budget subcommittee meet and make a recommendation on the budget to the city council by December 31st.
All right, all those in favor, say aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign.
Aye.
I'll need a roll call, please.
All right.
Collins?
No.
Kristen?
Yes.
Pearson?
Yes.
Miller?
No.
Topa?
No.
Wilson?
No.
Kellum?
Yes.
Conley?
No.
Kozinski? No. Coburn?
No.
Johnson?
No.
Four yeses.
You beat me.
7 noes.
All right. So, consideration of the resolution before us. We've had some discussion. Is there any more discussion, or?
Can we talk about the budget a little bit more? I'm wondering about the 500,000 that we borrowed. Now, did we borrow that from the Pepsi fund, or is that a one-time donation from the Pepsi fund for equipment replacement?
We took $300,000 from equipment replacement.
And I'm asking about your intentions. Are you intending to pay it back, or are you intending to just do that every year?
No, we were intending to pay it back with, we took $300,000 from equipment replacement to plug a hole, not last year, 2 years ago, to plug a hole in the budget, in the general fund budget. And what we're proposing this year is to put $500,000 from the settlement money into the equipment replacement fund. So you can call it paying it back, or however you want to consider it, but we would, that's the effect, is to pay back that $300,000 plus add $200,000.
Well, I guess what I was hoping was that you were planning on paying back that 500,000
to the PepsiCo fund.
To the Pepsi fund.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. I mean, you've got, depending on what happens with future revenue, but it's, it's not going to happen real soon. Now, again, I want to make the point that things can change pretty quickly. We sometimes forget that.
Yeah.
And I used the example earlier this year of, it was only a year ago, September, that I was reporting to the city council that I was really, really worried about the building fund because my building official was panicking.
Yeah.
He was worried about whether he'd have money to make payroll. They're now what? They have an $800,000 surplus.
Get your 500 from that.
Can you pay that to the Pepsi fund?
That's a great idea. You know, Rich, now you gave me my soapbox. You shouldn't have been, because the state, it used to be that building funds were in the general fund, but the legislature in their infinite wisdom pulled them out. That's another long story. But in any event, I use that story to illustrate that things can change more quickly than we sometimes realize. And, yes, there is a certain amount of hope or optimism, but you could also say it's not unreasonable. I mean, there's two dangers here. There's the danger of viewing the world so negatively and so pessimistically because we face challenges that it's woe is us, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, and we're all in a lot of trouble, versus when in fact we're pretty lucky. I mean, the kinds of challenges that we're debating here we're not Vallejo, California, or Stockton, California, or Detroit, Michigan, where, cities across the United States are trying to figure out how to get out of bankruptcy. I mean, that's not the issue here. And we're, so the glass is both half full and half empty, I guess.
Yeah, I'm under the impression we're a lot better off than Corvallis, for instance, which is a lot closer.
Well, Corvallis got a nice infusion of cash when their voters just approved a new levy this year, and they have a lesser issue with compression because they're not competing with their county, which also, like we do here for resources. But yeah, actually, we are better off than Corvallis, if you look at the Moody's ratings, which had given them a negative outlook on their credit rating, versus us, who have had a stable outlook and been very positive. So, yeah, but the point is that we are facing challenges. There is a reasonable expectation that we can work our way through the difficult times that we have, and and come out the other side in fairly decent shape. And if the city council or the budget committee were to say to us, well, we don't like X, Y, Z things that you as staff have proposed, if you tell us to do something, that you don't approve it, and you want us to do something different, we'll do something different. Now, you may not like what we respond with to that, but we'll give it a good shot. And I mean, there are. I mean, for example, if you were tonight to say, all right, I don't like the transfer from the settlement funds, that's a bad choice. We could immediately leap to the to franchise fees and say, okay, we're going to propose raising franchise fees. I mean, that's one option. That's a solution. Or we could say, we'll drop our year-ending fund balance estimate. That seems painless, but I've cautioned against that in the past. So There's a whole range of things that you could
Well, I'm
do.
tending to agree with Bill that I really hate the idea of getting in the habit of rating the Pepsi fund every year. And if you have the intention of paying that back, well, we need more than intention. You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but
Well,
I don't know,
yeah,
if I
I-
made a motion to not take money out of the Pepsi fund like that anymore, I'd probably tend to second it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would take issue. I don't think we have rated it every year. I think this is like the first.
Well, no, but there's always a first year. And it looks like this is the first year.
I think this is the first time we.
Well,
The 300,000 was not from the Pepsi fund. That came from equipment replacement. We rated that fund, so this is the first time we have proposed in a budget to take money from the PepsiCo fund for what had been considered an operating expense. And the justification, if you were looking for a justification, is that this is actually for a capital purchase. I mean, and many cities, as Councilor Collins has pointed out on numerous occasions, do not have fully funded equipment replacement funds. That's been a good practice, one I strongly encourage us to continue, but it's not necessarily done in all jurisdictions. I mean, it's just something that a lot of places go with lease purchase agreements, or they go out for bond measures to fund equipment. So, I'm not advocating that, but at the same time, I want to be clear that we're not talking about using these monies, the PepsiCo monies, for a salary that is an ongoing expense.
Well, that'd be worse, yes.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if the committee feels badly about rating the Pepsi fund, or whether
Yes.
it's...
Yes.
Well, let's get it on the table so we can move it forward. I move for adoption of the resolution, of the budget resolution. Then we can discuss it after there's a second, and then we can have a vote.
Second.
All right, discussion?
So how do we feel
The
about the
resolution
Pepsi
as
fund?
is?
Is that a piece of money there that we're just going to whittle away on an annual basis?
I think quite honestly, we just need to vote, and that'll
On the
dictate,
budget.
and that will
That'll tell
dictate,
people what it is.
dictate whether we need to consider other options. If the resolution passes, then we're done, we go home. If it doesn't, then I think we need to come up with some recommendations for Wes and staff on what we'd like changed.
I would just make the
Well-
comment that I don't like it, that I don't want to do it, so.
Or you can offer an amendment and see if the amendment flies. Then vote on the main motion or the amended motion.
Right, correct.
So you're suggesting that if the amendment is needed, now is the time to amend, rather than...
Doesn't
adopting
have to
the
be,
whole
but
thing.
No, it wouldn't have
that
to
has
be.
to happen with those who put the motion out there.
I'm not in favor of straw polls. Let's vote on it and see where we stand.
Okay.
All right. All those in favor of the resolution as it stands before us, say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed, same sign?
Aye.
Roll call?
Collins,
No.
Chrisman,
No.
Harrison,
No.
Keller,
Yes.
Canova,
No.
Olson,
Reluctantly, I'm going to vote yes.
Kellum,
No.
Holly,
Yes.
Sinsky,
Yes.
Coburn,
No.
Johnson,
No.
Thompson.
Yes.
Six yeses, seven noes, so it didn't pass.
Any yeses?
So my suggestion is we direct staff to come back with a modified budget that does not include transferring $500,000 of the Pepsi revenue into the budget for any purpose. So as you stated, you'll have to come up with that money someplace else. I don't I guess we should maybe have a motion, if that is the desire and intent of the majority of this budget committee. It wouldn't be resolved tonight in terms of a budget that we could approve. We need to give staff time to work on that. So I'll make a motion that the budget committee directs staff to come back with a revised budget that does not include a transfer of $500,000 from the Pepsi settlement funds.
Second.
Seconded. Tom?
Okay, Sharon?
In order to bring that back, then we're having to reconvene back the budget committee, and staff has to go through all of the notifications and all that. Would you be taken into consideration is if the 500,000, say, put it in there as a placeholder now, but within, in 6 months, half of the fiscal year, staff has to come back with a plan that's going to be bringing that money back into the Pepsi proceeds. So it's more like being done as a loan, want it back into the Pepsi staff time to be able to look to see what our revenue stream looks like, know more what property tax revenues are, if there's, and that way would come back. So it's not, it's just loaning to the equipment replacement and not as
Sort of a variation of the mayor's suggestion, and what staff members behind my back were whispering was, you don't really have to do anything. You could just say, you could approve, you could just take out the $500,000 transfer. Direct us to take out the $500,000 transfer and approve the budget. We would then, staff, I think, would, my personal desire would then be to come back to council at some point with a recommended change so that, we deal with the issues that creates. But, I mean, you could adopt a budget without that transfer, and we aren't, it just means we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't be repaying the money into the equipment replacement fund, and we would not be able to make the purchase of the ambulance chassis. But we could come back to the council with a plan on how to accomplish those things.
Well, I think that what this group does is approve a proposed budget, and then ultimately the budget comes to council for approval. At that time, those changes could maybe be looked at. I think there might be other options other than not buying the chassis. What that echoes to me is, approve this school board budget or this school budget, or we're going to cut sports and we're going to quit busing children. I don't want to resolve the issue that way, although my motion doesn't give any specific directive on how you fill that hole.
Right, exactly. And I am assuming that the city council does not want to leave those holes that not transferring 500,000 creates, and that we would be able to come back to you, with a different proposal. But for the sake of not having the budget committee have to meet again, you could pass the budget without that transfer, and we would still be able to move forward.
I think I owe Sharon an answer because she asked a question. My concern goes a little deeper when Wes mentioned that it was 2 years ago, took $300,000 or borrowed $300,000 from equipment placement to go into the general fund. And like Dick says, I'm sure the intent was to repay that. However, for 2 years they haven't been able to repay it, so now the solution is to borrow money from another fund. And getting back to Scott's reference or analogy of the personal budget, and granted, I realize there's a big difference between a city budget and a business budget and a personal budget and so forth. But the analogy, to take it a step further, Scott, is that you've eaten up all your savings, you've quit paying into the 401k retirement. In fact, you started borrowing from the 401k fund, and at the same time, you've told your wife, well, we're doing fine.
And you get a credit card.
Yeah, and that's the analogy I have, is that I think the problem is we keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing with no good plan to turn it back. Again, back to the home budget, I'm hoping the boss gives me a raise, or maybe I can get a second job. Yeah, I think Wes is right. I think things will turn around, and you're absolutely right. They can turn around real quick, but that's, again.
Well, and I understand the fear, but I would remind you that we got, that's actually it's $10.5 million in that fund. We've told you, and you noticed, that we have an equipment replacement fund for IT of $1.8 million. We have reserves, and big reserves in our utilities, and we're talking about amounts here of a few $100,000 that we're shifting around. Now, I'm not saying it's good, and I'm not saying it's the way we should go, but I do think we should keep it in perspective, that it's not like we're on the mat here with people fanning us to keep us alive. Yeah. I mean, we are doing what I think people often do, is you're looking at your available resources and trying to allocate them in a way that makes sense given the circumstances that you confront. And I can understand the council wanting to have a policy that says, by gosh, these funds are so important to us, and we were so, they're hard to come by, and we know we aren't going to get them replenished, and so we don't want to see them depleted. That's a fair policy statement, but I wouldn't translate it into we're in huge trouble here and the world is sinking under us.
The heartburn that I have with it is that we are kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then there is silence. Now what do? There have been people on the dais who say, we don't want to know what the options are, essentially. When I ask for prioritization, I'm told, oh, don't tell people that because they'll feel bad. I mean, that's what you folks do all the time, is you prioritize stuff. I'm simply saying it needs done more openly, so it is the council who's saying, this is more important than that in our, it goes back to what Floyd says. What's the most important thing you do? Well, it's X, Y, and XX, and AB, and, what's more important? Making sure somebody doesn't get killed, or making sure we have nice music? Well, that's not a question for me. So I'm of the opinion, I think we ought to send you back and say, come back with something that looks different.
Floyd?
I don't. I think the...
Dick. Floyd wanted to talk when Rich did.
Pardon me.
We'll get to you in a minute.
Ask Stuart for clarification on the definition of transfer and loan again.
Yeah, what's been provided in our budget in the amounts we're talking about are transfers that are one-time authorizations from the city council. Under Oregon budget law, there are restrictions on loans and specifications of really two types of loans that can be made. And we could describe those, or what's in the budget is a transfer. And what was in the budget 2 years ago was a transfer.
But what is the definition of a loan? Has to be paid back with time specific?
Yes. So if a loan is for an operational purpose, it has to be paid back within the same fiscal year.
If it's for a capital purpose?
If it's for a capital purpose, it needs to be paid back within 10 years.
So, at least in theory, we could approve the budget, just clarify that the $500,000 is a loan, and then as situations shift, and we know better what the revenue issues are in the fall, we may not need to take that loan. It's an appropriation for a loan. It's not the actual loan itself, $500,000. So if other revenue came in, you could fill the $500,000 in equipment by the other revenue. You wouldn't affect the loan out of the Pepsi fund.
Right.
I think that would be a clean way of doing it. It's explicit that we're using it only as a short-term potential gap filler to be paid back within time specific, and if other revenue comes in, we don't take the loan at all. Much the same as we have with the $500,000 in lieu of franchise fee as a last resort transfer into the general fund.
We have a motion already.
So, the motion on the floor is to have Wes come back with modifications that don't utilize that. Certainly, one of the modifications could be, we're going to classify it as a loan with the intent of paying it back. That I would be more comfortable with than just a transfer with no guarantee that it would be paid back.
Well, we can make that call tonight, Bill.
Pardon me?
We can make that call tonight.
I understand.
Dick, did you still have a comment?
I was going to suggest that Bill could withdraw his motion and we could do something along the lines of what the mayor and Wes and now Floyd are suggesting. I think that would solve the problem as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I'll withdraw my motion, and if that's all right with the second, and I don't remember who the second was.
I was. What's in it for you? Yeah, I'll withdraw.
So, I think you have the floor. Let's hear your motion.
I would
A
move
case
that
of beer.
I would move that we classify the $500,000 in equipment in the settlement funds as a loan and not as a transfer, and it only be implemented if sufficient revenues aren't available elsewhere in the general fund.
I'll second that.
So, question on one of the things Wes mentioned was the chassis replacement. So, from what, if I understand your motion, what staff would do would be to try and find that $200,000 somewhere else for that chassis replacement. And if they could not find it, then they would borrow that from the Pepsi settlement.
To be repaid.
And they might only borrow $200,000, not the full $500,000.
Correct, or $50,000 if that's the shortfall.
So I'm comfortable with that interpretation if Wes is, he's nodding for the record.
So Floyd, your motion's only pertaining to the $500,000 as a loan, you're not approving the whole budget as a modification?
That'd be one issue, then if that passes, then I'll make another motion, because the budget, the resolution then as presented would be fine.
All right.
Just need to ask questions. So then, if they do need, say they do need $400,000 or $500,000, how soon would it have to be paid back?
Well, Stuart said, 10 years at the most.
Yeah.
See, and then that puts us kind of back to where some of the other things that we've taken money out and it doesn't get, it just doesn't come back within a time period where we might need it. And so if it were like a short term, no problem. But when it's long term like that, I think,
Well, I think
10 years is the
I've got at
best.
least 2 more budget years to go before I'm off council, and if things turn around and we're able to repay it in a year, we repay it in a year, but the 10-year statutory limitations, it's got to be paid for in the 10-year period. There's nothing that prohibits you from early prepayment.
I think if nothing else, they've gotten the idea that we don't really like you to borrow from the Pepsi fund.
That's all. Perspective.
All right. All those in favor of Floyd's current motion to,
Point of order, could we just go ahead and have a roll call vote?
okay.
Collins?
Yes.
Chrisman?
No.
Pearson?
No.
Keller?
Yes.
Canova?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes?
Kellum?
No.
Yes.
Kobzinski?
Yes.
Yes.
Johnson?
No.
Thompson?
Yes.
9 to
10 and 4.
All right, thank you. Motion carries.
And with that, I would move the resolution as presented with the clarification of the motion we just made.
Ready? Okay. Go ahead. Roll call vote.
Collins?
Yes.
Chrisman?
No.
Pearson?
No.
Keller?
Yes.
Canopa? Holden?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Kellum?
No.
Connolly?
Yes.
Kibzinski? Yes. Coburn?
Yes.
Johnson?
No.
Thompson?
Yes.
Okay, 94, motion carries. Is there any other business tonight?
Can't hear you, Sharon.
Sharon?
I want to thank the Budget Committee, so everybody put in a lot of time and a lot of input, a lot of good dialogue, so thank you.
Here, here.
Okay. All right, meeting adjourned.